pleasure to have a chance to talk with friends who are engaged in arguably the major challenge to the American people in this particular period of its history. A close friend of mine last year or the year before, in the midst of a period when both Iraq and Iran were in the news a good deal, said, you know, in the Middle East and U.S. policy, history is repeating itself first as tragedy, then as farce. And this is, I think, an appropriate way of thinking about this present historical moment. I believe the anti-war movement and the movement against militarism in this country is the saving remnant of American society. It is what stands between the political elite of this country and the utter ruination, the utter degradation of what is left of decent values in this country as far as its role in the world is concerned. And the anti-war movement has been doing its job in recent months as far as Iran is concerned. It has been calling out the danger of this situation, talking about the likelihood or the possibility of U.S. war against Iran, and it has been pushing for a legislative fix to ban a U.S. attack on Iran. All this is needed, it needs to continue. But my message tonight is that it's not enough. The anti-war movement needs to be able to take on a more complex task than simply say, war is coming, get ready, oppose it, and try to stop it. And that is for the following reason. The main threat of war, the main danger of war right now is not, contrary to what I think most people understand today, it is not that the administration has already made up its mind to go to war against Iran, to attack Iran out of the blue. Rather, I'm going to argue tonight that the real danger, the greatest danger of war, is that this administration will blunder, bumble, fumble, miscalculate, have accidents, and find itself getting into a war that really it did not, except for Dick Cheney and a few other neoconservatives in the administration, did not really want. Let me begin by taking you through this sort of historical situation that has to do with the threat of war and try to analyze the important ingredients of the situation. First, we have a big war going on in which the United States is deeply involved and is in a losing position. Secondly, we have a country across the border from where that war is taking place, which the United States accuses of troublemaking, meddling, sending arms and giving training to the anti-US forces. The United States government, many people in the US government believe that threatening war against this country, this state, which is uncooperative with the United States, if it's done right, if it's done often enough, with enough bluster and enough credibility, will cause that uncooperative state to back down and become more cooperative and agree to US demands on that country. And finally, we have US naval forces being sent to the Gulf to be provocative, to show the flag, to intimidate, and this is a combustible mixture. And I suggest to you that I can tell you already what the consequences are going to be, how this is going to end. We already know how this is going to end. It's going to end with the United States miscalculating and going into a war with this state, which the President of the United States didn't really want, and which occurs because the national security team was too overconfident that trying to coerce this enemy state by threatening bombardment, by threatening a terrible air war, threatening devastation against this country, would in fact allow the United States to coerce that country into an agreement on our terms. And I can tell you how it ends up, because it's already happened. Because, my friends, the case I'm talking about is not Iran, it's Vietnam. This is how we went to war in Vietnam. It is not well known, but the reality, the historical reality of the US entry into war in Vietnam is that what happened in 1964, in early 64, was the national security team of the Johnson administration believed that if they threatened North Vietnam with bombing, and if they did a little bit of it, if they could just get a little bite of that apple, if they could just do a little bombing, the North Vietnamese would be intimidated enough so that they would back off and they would not give assistance to the Viet Cong in the South, and in fact would be willing to work out some kind of a deal with us on our terms. To make the long story short, that was a fundamental miscalculation. It reflected the fact that the United States was the world's dominant power. No one else in the world, the Soviets, the Chinese, let alone the North Vietnamese, were even in the same universe in terms of military power as the United States. And because of that complete military dominance, the political foreign policy elite of this country believed in the efficacy of the threat of war and wanted to have a chance to demonstrate that, and that's what the Gulf of Tonkin crisis was, of course, about. That Gulf, rather than the Persian Gulf. That Gulf of Tonkin crisis was about the US foreign policy elite finding an opportunity by using provocative naval power, getting an incident that, first of all, they thought would serve the purpose of being able to retaliate. And then when Lyndon Johnson didn't bite on that first incident that really was a North Vietnamese attack on a US ship in the Gulf of Tonkin, a second incident somehow occurred, even though we now know it didn't occur. And Johnson then retaliated for the first time, bombing North Vietnam. The thought was that the North Vietnamese would then become more reasonable, quote unquote. In fact, we now know that the opposite happened. The North Vietnamese increased the speed with which they prepared to fight a big war in South Vietnam. They began to send troops to the south, main force units to the south for the first time, as a result of their perception that the United States was prepared to go to war, to fight for South Vietnam as well as to fight North Vietnam. I think that the parallels between the way in which the United States went to war in Vietnam and the way in which we are poised to go to war against Iran today are striking, they're absolutely astonishing.